Okay, so this is some material that we started to look at last week, but I also wanted to present it to you in a way that you could think about it in a bit more depth as well, and think about how these ideas might apply to your own writing. Both it's something you might want to think about for your reflective blog summary, but it's also something you might want to incorporate into your second assignment. We've looked at plot arcs before, but we haven't really talked about a character arc. A character arc is similar to a plot arc, but it's not necessarily the same thing. It talks about what happens to the character in response and in relation to the events of the story. So yes, it's related to the plot arc, but because a character can exist beyond a book or beyond the certain events that you're talking about in that story, they are also separate to that story arc. And it's a good thing to think about because it makes you understand that people's flaws and imperfections actually are the stuff that you can make stories out of. And through the story, that your characters can develop and grow by overcoming obstacles and by facing and encountering things that perhaps perplex them at first or force them, encourage them to think about the world in a different way. The character arc can be positive or negative, and characters can even not change, perhaps if they're minor characters or if this is more of an action-oriented flick. They'll often you might hear of there's character-orientated novels as opposed to action-orientated novels. They don't necessarily have to be distinct. You can have both in one novel. It's certainly a good idea to be thinking both in terms of the character development and what sort of action you might want to include in your story. There are some examples of two different types of character arcs. I actually just got these from Wikipedia, but they're good examples, so hopefully you might be familiar with them. But in Tootsie, if you remember the very famous comedy film where Dustin Hoffman is an out-of-work actor and has to pretend to be a woman to get a job on a soap opera, and it begins, a little bit chauvinistic, not really sensitive to women's issues. But after experiencing what it's like being a woman and being treated like a woman, he changes and he has different views and a different capacity for love as a result by the end of the film. Another example in Empire of the Sun, the main protagonist there, he begins as a child playfully. And then life comes in and deals him some rather vicious blows, and he's separated from his families and traumatised. So his character arc is actually about his downfall from this delightful child to a wounded adult. Another very human story. In non-fiction, which is what you're basically writing as a travel writer, you're not always dealing with characters that you've made up. You're writing about real people. That brings in a whole lot of other issues again. There are ethical issues about representing people fairly and being authentic in your representations, and also issues about being sensitive to their own way of seeing themselves. Which is not to say that you can't have your perspective, but there are obviously political issues around that. You also would need to be careful to make sure that your representations are accurate, because if you do make any false representations about anybody that you've met, you could be liable to a libel suit. And if they claim it was false and damage their reputation, you are at risk. Now, even though you have the limitation that you're dealing with the people and talking about real people that you've met, not people who you've crafted for a narrative purpose, you can nevertheless control that aspect of characterization in your articles and stories in particular ways. First, through research, that you can choose to look for particular types of people to feature in your stories, to meet with, to engage with, and engage with them in particular events or particular types of ways. You can also, when you're writing about those people, choose to reveal certain aspects of their character at different points. So we, as the reader, may get to know them better or see different aspects of them as the story progresses. And your ability to do that, of course, depends again on your ability to see and understand those deeper, more complex dimensions of those people. So that's something that you you gain through observing people and studying people, and getting to know people across different cultures yourself. So how do you engage with and show us the complexities of a person? One of the values of good creative writing is to have really rich and engaging characters. So how can you ensure that that happens in your travel writing as well? Well, as I said, it's about looking for those layers of a personality, looking for the contradictions and the mixed emotions that might exist in any type of encounter. If you look at this example, it's from a poem called My Papa's Waltz by Theodore Roth. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. We romped until the pan slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. At every step you missed my right ear, scraped a buckle. You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. That's a very touching, and it becomes touching because of the complexity of that childlike delight in a moment of abandon and play with a father, as opposed to the awareness of the dangers inherent in that and the sense of nervousness in that as well. So it's the comparison and the linking of some very sometimes contradictory emotions that can actually give something an emotional power. And when you're the main character, which is also often the case in your travel writing, you want to think, are you going to change through the course of your story? And if you are going to change, how are you going to do that? And again, you could almost set yourself up for quests that would prompt a certain change or encourage you to revisit some issues in your life. That's something that you can do. Or if not, if there was an impact, a travel experience that really had a strong impact upon you, why was that? And think back again at the time, what themes did it trigger for you? And then you can focus your storytelling around those encounters that would have brought those themes to the surface and focus them. So was it that someone's seeking to escape the past, trying to find yourself tasting love for the first time or independence for the first time? Who or what do you meet to trigger or challenge those themes? And you can imagine about independence, there's fear and uncertainty as opposed to thrill and a sense of competency. So the different types of situations you might find yourself in that would trigger all of those emotions would be useful for you in your story. Short stories obviously may only offer flashes or quick moments of insight. Generally for your longer stories, you're going to want to experience and express more substantial shifts in that character development. Things to watch for that can help you also craft an intriguing and sophisticated characterization into your stories is to think, when you're observing people and engaging with people, what's not being seen, what's not being said, and what's not being understood, because people don't often, or don't always, I should say, understand each other. And that's often they may not even listen to one another, as we were looking at last week when we did look at examples of people talking at each other rather than actually having a conversation where they're listening to each other. So look at people and how they interact with each other. Consider that and how they respond to the world around them. What choices do they make? How do they behave? Those sorts of complexities can feed into your writing as well. And which is how they then link to our discussion of Orientalism, which we have seen already from last week, involves thinking about the way that people in general the world over don't necessarily understand each other very well or see each other as for who we really are. There's a sense of othering, which is putting someone who's different to us into the strange, possibly very suspicious category. As we discussed, this is just to reflect on what we talked about last week, the film Blade Runner, which is generally regarded as a masterpiece of speculative fiction, has also been criticised for Orientalism because it used the Asian face as a metaphor for the weird, strange, exotic, in a cool way, but it was nevertheless exoticised, this Asianness. And for an Asian person watching it, that might be quite odd because, you know, if you're not feeling strange, how does it feel to have someone else present you as the strange, the weird? We saw a video rendition of this done very well by the Australian Aboriginal crew who made BBQ Area. And they turned this tradition of particularly the God narrator, they call it the voice of God style, where the narrator discusses and defines and analyses the world around them, which they have often been the subject of and subjected to, and they actually did that as people talking about the white people in the suburbs and as a race, a particular type of race that you would study, and it was quite a potent insight. And actually, at the time when it came out, it actually did make people realise what that type of treatment might feel like. So if you haven't seen that, I do recommend you have a look at that as well. We also talked about Edward Said and his seminal work, Orientalism, which single-handedly, although there had been a lot of discussion in this area at the time, but it was really his work that captured people's heart, and he challenged what had been a few centuries worth of discourse and study of the Oriental countries and cultures by the West. And because of the history of the West, that study was often tied to imperialism. So there were inherent power structures within that study. And from Edward Said's work and questioning and challenging of those particular perspectives, the study of the Oriental got tainted, if you like, or seen to be unmasked as a political device. Instead of being seen as an erudite study, it was actually, people started to question whether this was another agency of an imperialist tradition. So that was a useful reflection for people and a discussion for people to have. In the overview article that was also went with that from last week's readings, it was shown that in fact in turn Edward Said's critique had been critiqued, that he had been shown to be equally generalist at times and dualist in response to what he saw as dualism. Nevertheless, he made an important contribution, particularly in terms of making people more aware of the unfair way and often untrue way that Middle Eastern people in particular, but people who just simply weren't Western, were being represented both in the media and in the academic discourse. And as he says, it was political. It was really about promoting difference between what was familiar, the Europe, and the strange. And he says, on the one hand, there are Westerners, and on the other, there are Arab Orientals. So the Westerners, he says, are rational, peaceful, liberal, logical, capable of holding real values without natural suspicion, where the latter are none of these. And as I said, these sorts of tendencies can still be seen today, the way that Middle Eastern people are presented in both the news and in computer games. Studies have been done and show that this stereotyping still goes on. Now, in terms of that overview, the author makes the reference that in terms of Foucauldian terms, now Foucault, Michel Foucault, he was a French postmodern theorist who had a great deal of influence in terms of 20th century thinking around the change between this idea that there is one vision of a true way of being, which often people ascribed to in the past when there weren't as many people travelling, as opposed to this idea that in a global world there may be many different truths and different visions. And the author says discourse is culturally productive, often politically determined system of statements which create a prevailing truth about reality for both dominant groups and the dominated. Discourse not only shapes the way both groups apprehend the world through the availability of ideas and circulation at a particular historical moment, but it also produces reality for them by construing and constraining what can be articulated. So discourse is the way that a society talks about, represents, and thinks about particular issues. The thinking of the day. To give you an insight into what he's talking about there, I found that when I understood about Michel Foucault's early life, that really helped me understand his arguments. when he was younger, he actually really struggled a lot with his own homosexuality and suffered depression as a result and indulged in self-harming behaviours. Now, he was forced into psychiatric treatments, actually, and he found that a very traumatic experience, as they set out to, in quotation marks, cure him. So this experience gave him insights into the way that people are subject to this idea of what is truth. And he saw it as not necessarily being the truth, but just a particular way of seeing and way of understanding that has dominance at a particular point of time, depending on that cultural history and the context of that particular moment. So he could see that things that were not necessarily even true could really come to be just accepted as reality. And a more contemporary example of this, I don't know if you saw this was going around social media last year, and it's an art project by a woman called Esther Wong. And she was working with freelance graphic artists from around the world and realised that it would be interesting to just try and experiment. And she took a photo of herself without makeup, no special effects, that's the middle photo in this grid, and sent it to different graphic artists around the world and said, "Make me beautiful." There was no other direction other than that. She just left it open for them to interpret how they would. And as you can see, they interpret it incredibly differently. How they perceived beauty, what was understood to be beautiful, and how beauty was represented was very much culturally framed and culturally particular. If you think about how much difference it can make in your life, if you are considered to be beautiful within a cultural frame, you can understand then how powerful these particular cultural frameworks can be in someone's life. And there are other examples of this in terms of how women are brought up to behave, to dress, and how men are represented in the media and brought up to behave and dress. So you, as a person, can actually become subjectified to this discourse, this way of thinking and seeing and representing values. And it can actually be normalised to the point you may not even be aware of it or think of it. An example might be the almost cliche idea of the Great White Hope. And now that relates to the idea that it takes a Westerner to go into these situations and save people. And let's not forget, there are no doubt many Westerners who actually have done a lot of good and have used their position of privilege to really, really contribute and give back. However, there is a certain amount of discomfort in some circles about the assumption that it has to be necessarily a Westerner and the representation of this saviour as traditionally always being a Westerner. And related to that, I was remembering a scene from a film I've talked about a couple of times in class called The Darjeeling Limited. And it's about three brothers doing a train odyssey across India. And they're going in search of their absent mother, who's been absent from them for most of their life. And she's actually taken up residence in a convent in India where there's an orphanage. And she actually has a real role and authority there. She's like a saving mother figure in this orphanage in India. And they obviously really look up to her. And the boys try and find her, and she disappears. She basically goes away again and leaves them. So it was a classic example of the flaws and the weaknesses in that assumption about the role that Westerners could play, which is not to say, as I say, that Westerners don't have a great deal of wonderful contributions to make, but to just be aware of some of the political question marks around those efforts. Other issues that you may not be aware of are concerns about cultural appropriation. You've probably already heard about the history of sacred artefacts being basically taken by explorers and early archaeologists, and local cultures really making efforts to retrieve their own cultural heritage from museums around the world. Also, of course, there's a history of Indigenous artists who are really highly regarded internationally, and people go into the communities and buy the art for a pittance, and then they make a huge profit on that. So you can imagine in really very poor Indigenous communities that also causes quite a bit of tension. Other things you may not be aware of are concerns about the use of instruments being taken out of context or healing modalities being taken out of context, particularly by the New Age movement, who does this very, very sincerely and is really into exploring and wanting to know different cultures better, but may not understand the context or be completely connected with them. For instance, Tibetan bowls, Tibetan healing bowls, often actually they exist within a cultural tradition and are used in particular contexts and for particular circumstances, and yet they're now sold in marketplaces around the world. So in a way, the culture has lost control of some of its very sacred practices. In Australia, there's the didgeridoo, which requires circular breathing to play, and for that reason, women are not always encouraged to play because it can cause miscarriage to engage in circular breathing. But women around the world are now playing it. So there are tension points there. And I'm not to say that any one particular person necessarily owns culture. That's a debate in itself. However, there are things to be aware of. Things you may not even be aware of, for instance, another one is copyright. In our culture, it's generally understood that a journalist who gathers material and puts it together into a story owns the copyright on that story unless it's been commissioned by their newspaper or broadcaster. Or a photographer owns the rights on their photograph. The creator owns the rights. In Aboriginal culture, it's very different. They're actually born to a story, and that is their story. For example, there might be a lightning bolt that's seen at the time of a baby's birth. So that baby is considered to be the carrier of the lightning, and the only person who has the right to tell that story. So if they tell that story to you, and then you publish it and make money, they feel like you haven't given them their fair due. Now, their understanding of copyright, which is as a birthright, is not recognised under our law. However, ethically, as a journalist, you may want to take that into account. There was an Australian man called the Bush Tucker Man, and he used to go around and talk to everyone about their traditional bush healing and ways that they would use some of the Australian vegetation. And at the time, it probably, the culture was not ready, because this was over 20 years ago, for an Indigenous presenter. However, you can imagine today, I don't think today it would be acceptable for a Western presenter to be going in and presenting Indigenous cultures in that way and being the Bush Tucker Man. I think that would be much more expected to be an Indigenous presenter and the Indigenous community owning that presentation. Now, this is not to say that you necessarily have to be really hampered in by being politically correct at all times, and you can't be honestly talk about some of the disjunctures and the discomfort and the gawkiness that can happen in cultural encounters, cross-cultural encounters. And this is one of the reasons I included the excerpt by Carolyn Shine, who wrote Single White Female in Illinois, and who was, by the way, the love of the life of Tara, who was featured in the Australian story, the lady who went to Cambodia and started to set up foster care for local orphans there. She's now passed. She was a very colourful, passionate musician who was a vegetarian because she just sincerely and deeply loved animals. And she was very committed to social justice, very interested in science, and sincerely open in her travels in Vietnam, but also cheeky and also challenged at times by the cultural disconnections that she encountered. And here's an example. She's in a class. She was teaching English over in Hanoi, and one evening her class asks her, "Is it true that cats in the Wests don't have to work?" And then they all lean forward and wait for her what she's going to say. And she says, "Yes, it's true. They don't work. They're pets and we care for them as a family." There's an extraordinary swell from the class. The concept of keeping a cat as a pet baffles them. In many ways, being upfront about those moments, which can be quite funny and quite disarming, is equally authentic. Now, I might say, however, that Carolyn includes this within a context where she is sincerely and genuinely exploring and making connections with the local people there in a very respectful way, but also honestly discussing her experience as a Westerner in this different situation. Another example on the reading list was Andrew Pham's wonderful book, Catfisherman. It's won a few literary prizes, and I do recommend it to you. And he was born in Vietnam but went to America very young. His family escaped Vietnam after the war as refugees. And so he goes back to Vietnam as a search for his identity. Like many people, his identity is a hybrid. He's living between two cultures. He's not necessarily entirely innate, and accepted. He doesn't necessarily feel he's entirely accepted in America, although he would have a place there because it is a multicultural country. But then even back home, there are tensions as well. However, he through this journey and writing those and embracing that journey, he actually reaches a sense of comfort with himself. Too many things have changed. Too much time has passed. I'm different now, a man with a pocket full of unconnected but terribly vivid memories. I was looking to dredge up what I'd long forgotten. Most of all, I'm wishing for something to fasten all these gems, maybe something to hold them in a continuity that I can comprehend. And that fluidity is very much a contemporary experience for many people. And this is the second quote. It's from someone who's actually making him different to them because he's going to live in America. So it's not to say, as I mentioned, that these experiences aren't real, aren't authentic, and aren't also important to your story. They may well be. Now, I included this. You may remember Barret. He became very famous for being offensive. I'm going to play you a short video. This is one where he goes to Cambridge University. His film is actually set in America, but given that Americans are outnumbered in our class, I thought I'd play you some of this. Let's see if I can.
I have come here to greatest university in world, Cambridge, where most famous men in world study. Isaac Newton, William Shakespeare, Kenneth Dalglish, Thomson Tools, to find why this is greatest university in world. Yakshimash. Welcome. Your name is? Ian. I have seen women here in Cambridge today. Yeah. Why are they here?
Well, because they are also clever.
Yes, we say in Kazakhstan that a woman who goes with book is like a horse with what you put on the horse. Yes.
Yes. I mean, the point is that half the world are women.
Yes.
And therefore half the intelligence, half the ability is with the women. The only difference is that they are not creative.
Yes.
Women haven't got creative minds.
It's true.
They can't think.
They cannot think properly.
No, they can't think.
We say in Kazakhstan, you find a woman with brain, I find you a horse with, how you say?
With wings.
Yes. And what is the Cambridge Ball? Everyone says the Cambridge Ball.
Cambridge balls are just big things where you dress up in white or black tie.
It is like a party.
Yeah, like a party.
And they bring in women specially for this?
No, there's no special women brought in. It's you bring your own woman, I'm afraid.
Yeah. And so they do not bring in prostitutes to...
Absolutely not. No prostitutes, I don't think.
So how do you have a party without...
Well, Well, in England we don't really use prostitutes at parties. It's one of these odd things.
Why not?
I don't know, just not traditional.
Will there be wrestling with no clothes and horse, polo?
Well, there certainly won't be wrestling with no clothes.
Yes.
There might be polo somewhere.
Yes.
But I think that some of the kinds of parties that maybe you're thinking of, you're not going to find here at all.
And will there be a woman where you go and you dress like a sex with them?
I'm sorry, you're going to have to cut that off. That's an inappropriate question. This is a serious university, and there's not going to be any sort of prostitution that you just mentioned. That would be inappropriate. Okay, we're going to...
So about forget the part then.
I'm sorry, that's over.
I think you get the general idea. Now, I have to pull this down. Sorry. I hope that you are not hearing me with lots of echo now. Now, one of the theorists discussing Barret and what Barret does, he says that, and in terms of the reactions that Barret gets from some of the people he's interviewing, he says, by assaulting Western viewers with a culture that does not ennoble, that deliberately arouses gleeful condescension, Barret helps to illustrate the frequent attacks on multiculturalism, that claims of respecting the other are a sham, that they contain a power imbalance that is ubiquitous but unstated. The real other, which he actually links Borak to, is by definition patriarchal, violent, neither the other of ethereal wisdom and charming customs. In an interesting argument, and particularly given that Barret is presented as the real other, in some ways I would argue that Barret actually gives some hints away. You actually realise looking at it that he's using this as a way to pretend to be a buffoon, but really mounting a critique on the culture that he's visiting. But yes, of course, there is this element, and there is a point where it can get really, really difficult and really challenging to cross those boundaries. And that's not to say that that isn't also a valid human story, but of course one that necessarily needs a lot of sensitivity to manage, because who's to say that one perspective is right or not? Some people would argue that there are absolute rights and wrongs, and other people argue that there aren't, that they're relative. And that is a perspective that is actually worth another lecture in itself, that whole debate. But just to say that these are actual authentic issues that you as a traveller may have to face. To end that discussion in terms of how it may relate to a character arc in your story, or how you can actually apply that thinking to your own writing, I really like this quote from Kim Dana Kupperman. She's actually talking about, and that link there links to the, I'll put this in the slides for last week, but it links to a discussion about how to incorporate characters in non-fiction writing with depth, and how she does that, her experience of writing about people in, she's talking about here, biography. But I think it's a really good insight into what could eventually be possibly character arc in these type of confronting situations. It took me a long time to learn that my relations were people struggling to do the best they could do, and that what might be considered bad behaviour was often a primal reaction to circumstances, some of which were beyond their control. Once I had that perspective and could see my mother, to name one character in my own family romance, as a person with desires and dreams, disappointments and betrayals, she became human in ways that I had never contemplated. And instead of her being cast in this drama only in the role of my mother, a woman who in reality pushed all my buttons, she transformed into a multidimensional character for whom anything, including her own happiness, was possible. And once that metamorphosis of thinking about her occurred, I was able to explore in my writing what happened to change her life, the circumstances that compelled her to act as she did, the reasons for her deep unhappiness. This is not about excusing someone's behaviour, but understanding it. And when she talks about writing about other people, she says her personal philosophy is try to avoid being mean-spirited. As much as possible, it's always a good idea to try and approach people with compassion and empathy and look for that bonding if possible. But as I say, that is a journey. It's a journey for the characters in your novel, or your article, and it could be as well a journey for yourself, both travelling and writing about your travels. That's our talk for today on Orientalism, and I hope that gave you a few ideas to think about, and that may also enrich your own future writing.